Well, thank you very much, Katya. Thanks everybody for coming to this class. And it's my honor to introduce today Professor Emerita of Slavic Studies at Rice University, Eva Thompson, a world-renowned scholar of Russian and Polish culture, author of numerous publications on the subject, including a very important book, particularly important for our class, which is Imperial Knowledge, Russian Literature and Colonialism. Professor Thompson.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much for this introduction. And I just will tell you right at the beginning, I'm not going to summarize my book. The book is to be read. I'm going to talk about things that emerged after I wrote the book. So right now, to my great satisfaction, colonialism and decolonization have become fashionable topics for humanistic scholars. When I wrote the book, it was not yet so, but now that's the case. So I'm very pleased that the subject is being considered and is being studied. And about a week ago, there appeared an article in New York Times about colonialism and decolonization. And would you believe it? Russia was not even mentioned in this article. So the New York Times is not the source of information about decolonization. This is just for your information. You can get other things in New York Times, but not this. So you see, there's still quite a lot of resistance to the idea that Russia was and still is a colonial empire. So as I describe things to you, you may find it rather shocking that I look at things this way, but well, this is the way I look at it. So maybe we should start with some definitions. Colonialism and nationhood. Now, modern colonialism started in the 18th century and came to its peak in the 19th century. Of course, there are many exceptions, and we know that the English moved to America already in the 17th century, but by and large, the most important way of looking, the most important wave of colonialism came in the 18th century, and then 19th century, as I said, it was the peak, and then 20th century, it began to decline. And it so happens that in the world, the idea of nationhood became also the most, one of the most accepted ideas already in the 18th century. And 19th century, almost the entire world was divided into national or other groups that had the same language, that shared the same culture, and had more or less the same history. And this is something that you have to remember, that colonialism is connected with nationalism. Now, I'm not using the word nationalism in the nasty sense of the word. I'm just using it in the neutral sense. When, say, Russia moved against its neighbors, it was colonialism. It was something that the world didn't notice as a colonial enterprise, but it was colonialism. The difference between Russia, say, and England in conquering colonies has been that in Russia conquered countries that were adjacent to it, whereas the British, the English went overseas and found their colonies that they conquered in faraway places such as Asia, Africa, and so forth. So of all the colonialist powers, two greatest ones are England and Russia. Now, we all know that England is a colonial, and was rather, a colonial power, but we do not know that about Russia. And again, you know, this took hundreds of books. It took thousands of scholars to imprint in our memory, in our minds, the idea that Russia was not and is not a colonial power. And it will take hundreds of scholars to undo that image. So I'm here really going against a big wave of scholars, and I'll mention them in my talk, that were and have been maintaining that Russia is just a nation state, which of course what the Russians frequently say. They are a nation state. They are not. They are really a colonial empire. So briefly again, what are the advantages of colonialism? Well, the most obvious advantage is you get a lot of material goods, raw materials. You get a lot of money, you make your country rich, you make the colonies poor. And this is the way the British used their colonies, and this is the way Russia used its colonies. However, there are big differences between the way Russia used its colonies and Great Britain did. Because Great Britain, in addition just to robbing those countries of raw materials, used that money that came from the colonies to develop new branches of industry, to develop, say, banking, insurance business, shipbuilding business, and so forth. This brought many advantages to the population of England and Great Britain. That meant that people in this country got richer. The standard of living went up. Now, how did Russia use its colonies? Well, quite differently. And here's the first thing to remember. Russia used its colonies in order to build St. Petersburg and then to build the army. When Peter the Great stood at the shore of the Baltic Sea, as Pushkin tells us so beautifully, and said, we are going to build a city here, he really was standing there in a place there was nothing there. And there was no money to build anything because Russia was a poor country. How do you think Russia built those palaces in St. Petersburg? Whose money was it? Well, the money came from the colonies. And which colonies? Colonies that Russia acquired through the partitions of Poland, which incidentally is the event in European history that's almost forgotten, and yet it was extremely important to the development of history in Europe. So there was a Polish poet named Adam Mickiewicz who wrote a poem in 1832 in which he said that the palaces of St. Petersburg were built stem from the sweat and tears of Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine. He mentioned these three countries, Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine. And indeed, you see, when partitions of Poland took place, Russia acquired an enormous amount of land west of its ethnic core. And by dispossessing, by taking away that land from those people that owned it, Russia acquired a lot of financial means. You may remember in War and Peace, Pierre Bezukhov inherits from his father lands near Kiev, says the narrator. What were those lands near Kiev? Well, these were the lands and estates that Catherine gave to Bezukhov's father when she dispossessed, when she removed the previous owners of those lands. And where did those owners go? Well, some of them went to Siberia, some of them were killed, some of them just went there begging because they were completely deprived of everything. So going back to how Russia used the money from its colonies, Russia built the city of St. Petersburg, which indeed is built out of tears and sweat of three nations that became part of the Russian Empire due to the partitions of Poland. And the second way in which Russia used money from colonies was and still is, I think, the building of the Russian army. Here, very, very interesting comparison again between Great Britain and Russia. In Great Britain, it took about 100 citizens to support one soldier. In Russia, it was about 12 citizens that supported one soldier. Do you see what that means? It means that people were kept in great poverty so that the army could be strong. When the first census was done in Russia in 1897, it turned out that the Russian Empire had something like 62 million people. Half of them were not Russian, by the way. There was empire, there was colonialism. And as I said, it was out of this population that the army of as many as 5 million was occasionally drawn. So you see that there was an enormous difference in the ways in which colonialists in Great Britain and in Russia used the advantages of material advantages of colonialism. That, of course, doesn't mean that Great Britain was shining light and Russia was bad. No, it just shows that not every colonialism, there are different kinds of colonialisms, and in many cases, some are worse, some are better. So these are the material advantages and disadvantages to the colonized of colonialism. But there is another kind of advantage that colonialism gives to the victors, and this is the ability to influence culture, something that we sort of take for granted. We do not notice it. We don't know what it means really. Well, there's a saying that the victors write history, and this is really a good saying to apply to colonialism, because what happened was in the 19th century, to a large extent in the 20th century, was that Russia was able to write the history of Eastern and Central Europe without really any interference, because she absorbed those territories. The people there were deprived of the possibility of reaching the international audience, and Russia wrote that history in such a way that Russia was put, in the good light, and those conquered territories were put in a bad light. Russia practiced it, by the way, not only with regard to Central and Eastern Europe, but also with regard to the Caucasus. If you look at the poems of Pushkin and Lermontov and how they describe the Caucasus, you can see that it seems that the Russians were the civilized force that descended upon the bunch of barbarians. Well, it was not always so. And one Russian writer, Leo Tolstoy, wrote something that contradicted that image, Haji Murad. But of course, this was not published in Tolstoy's lifetime. So there was some attempt in Russia to straighten out, to change the image of those conquered territories, but there were few and far between. So this third advantage of colonialism, the ability to present one's society and culture and history as innocent and attractive, and the cultures of the conquered peoples as primitive, sometimes criminal. And this is maybe the most important disadvantage of colonialism for those nations that were conquered. And I emphasize that modern colonialism is really about conquering groups of people that can be called nations, because they have already their own language, their own culture, their own history. So you may ask, and we all can ask ourselves, why was Russia not noticed as a colonial empire in the 19th century and really all the way to the mid-20th century? And I found 5 reasons for that. Well, first reason, Russia was remote. Russia was somewhere there on the outskirts of Europe, very far away. Nobody was really, you couldn't travel easily to that part of the world. We know that before modern transportation, electronics, and so forth, to travel in Russia was practically impossible. You could only travel with somebody from the government accompanying you. And of course, you could travel to Siberia and be left there. But basically, nobody visited Russia. There were those stories about white bears walking on the streets of St. Petersburg, all this nonsense, of course, because people didn't know that country. So, the country that's far away, you don't concentrate on what this country does, and you sort of do not place it among those countries that are in the focus of your attention as you study colonialism. So as I said, first thing was the remoteness of Russia. Now the second, and maybe the most important reason was and is still that Russia's colonies were not overseas. They were contiguous to Russia. They were adjacent to Russia. Russia didn't build ships and go somewhere, far away to get some colonies in Asia or Africa. Russia simply conquered smaller nations that were in the western part of, or west of Russia, east of Russia, north of Russia, and south of Russia. So, when you conquer your neighbor, it's easy if you are still another neighbor to say, oh, well, this is just a small thing, they got a little bit more territory. It's all Russia. Well, this is another way the Russians managed to avoid being called colonialists. Basically, they renamed the territories conquered Russia. Almost all the territories that Russia conquered were renamed Russia. Today, everybody thinks that Siberia is Russia. Well, it is not. What about the West? Well, you know how Russians called Poland? Przywyslanski kraj, the country near the Vistula. But of course, this was Russia, and on and on. And if you rename territories, you begin to feel, well, all this is Russia. This is not at all colonialism. This is just a big nation that covers half of the Eurasian continent. Another way in which Russia avoided the name of colonialist in Europe was something that I bet none of you knows. Russia was in the habit of bribing Western intellectuals in order to write works, pamphlets, letters, whatever, praising Russia and describing those conquered territories as barbaric, as in need of being led by somebody like Catherine the Great, somebody who was civilized, somebody who was enlightened, and so forth. And here's a very interesting story. Catherine paid Voltaire to write just such pamphlets during the partitions of Poland. Now, Voltaire was one of the most respected intellectuals in Europe in the 18th century. And anything he wrote was treated almost, like a second Bible, because they didn't believe in Bible much during the Enlightenment. So there's this Voltaire writing, that, Poland, very backward country, should disappear from the map. Here's Catherine that's going to enlighten and going to lead the country towards a better future. Well, the people believed it. And partitions of Poland sort of slid from the view of most Europeans. It was, something they just didn't pay attention to, because largely because of Voltaire's intervention. Now, a Polish scholar named Henryk Głębocki, a professor at Jagiellonian University, went to Moscow a couple of years ago and tried to get to the archives to study, those things in great detail. And you know what he was told? He was told that this is still a state secret, and he cannot go there. He cannot look at those documents. After 250 years, still a state secret? to understand to what extent Russia has treated its underground action, so to speak, seriously. No country has spent so much attention on sort of trying to persuade foreigners about whatever Russia was trying to do. Russia was this kind of country. And one more example that is a little bit later on, but also significant because it's the same problem of bribing foreigners. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 22, there was a vote in the United Nations condemning the invasion because it was a clear invasion of one country of another. And the Republic of South Africa did not vote to condemn Russia. Now, why? You know, they should be the ones that really were aware of what colonialism and what of foreign rule means. They fought for so many years, for decades, to have a majority rule in South Africa. And African National Congress was in opposition to the apartheid for decades. Well, African National Congress was largely supported by Russian money. And they felt grateful to Russia for paying that money. And so they did vote to condemn Russia, even though Russia did something that was clearly wrong and against their own beliefs and ideology. So you see the things that Russia did in order to avoid being called a colonial empire that actually worked out. And one more thing, one more reason why in the large body of scholarship that has already been written about colonialism, decolonization, and so forth, why there's so little about Russia. And again, I'm mentioning this article in the New York Times just a week ago. No Russia. Well, the reason is this. Among decolonization scholars, there are very many Indian and Pakistani scholars, such as Homi Bhabha, such as Gayatri Spivak, such as Lilia Gandhi, and so forth. And these scholars are adamantly opposed to the idea that colonialism can happen regardless of whether people are white or black or yellow or whatever. They believe that colonialism is always the oppression of colored people by white people. Well, that's not true. Because when you look, for instance, at Ireland, that was under the English boot for many centuries, and then finally regained sovereignty in the 1920s. When you look at Ireland, white people against other white people. And of course, when it comes to Russia's move westward, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Poland, two other Baltic republics, Moldova, Bulgaria, all this belt of nations between Germany and Russia. They're all white people. These were colonies. But you'll never persuade people from India and Pakistan that colonialism can be also white on white. And this is also an important reason why we do not see studies of Russian colonialism as frequently as we see studies of British colonialism, say. In fact, what we right now have is just a little bit of attention being paid to Russian colonialism. All the attention in decolonization studies is paid to those European powers like Great Britain, France, Belgium, very important colonialists and terrible colonialists when it comes to Africa and the crimes that they committed there, and several other European countries. But that's not true. Russia is just as colonialists as these powers. And now there's one more reason, that an important reason why Russia has not been noted as a colonial empire. Many professors that have taught at American universities, and I suppose same is true in Europe, were people that basically repeated the Soviet and Russian line in presenting the history of Russia. And I would like to mention 3 names here of people that influenced American views on Russia and influenced them in the wrong direction, so to speak. The first one is Nicholas Ryazanovsky, a great scholar, Russian, ethnically Russian, but he spent most of his life in the United States, professor at Harvard, author of many books, including the history of Russia, that went through many editions. I have the 10th edition published by Oxford University Press. So you couldn't get a better publisher, you couldn't get a better recommendation than this kind of situation. So what does Ryazanovsky do in his history of Russia? Well, many things, but I'll mention a few. First of all, when he describes the historical historical way that Russia developed, we start, of course, with Kiev. He starts with Kiev, then there's the Apennine period, and then there is the Muscovite period. Now, I understand that Russians claim the origin in Kiev because that's, there are several reasons for them to do so. However, I think what should have been mentioned in this description of Russia's development was that there's another nation that's claiming its origin in Kiev, and that is Ukraine. And right now, they are dead set on telling the world that, yes, we are Ukrainians, and our first center is Kiev. So for a scholar of world reputation, not to mention such things and saying, look, I'm here presenting the Russian point of view, but there's another point of view, Ukrainians. It's unbelievable. It's almost like a propaganda rather than real history. Then you go on and you see, of course, partitions of Poland are not even mentioned in one paragraph, not one paragraph. And really, partitions of Poland made Russia into the European country because Russia gained this enormous territory of people who use the Latin alphabet, who are familiar with Western Europeans, who got their education very often in Western Europe, and who were psychologically and culturally part of Western Europe. This is not even mentioned. And then finally comes the description of the 20th century and the Stalin-Hitler Pact, which was concluded in August of 1939. And then, as you know, Germany attacked Poland from the west, and Soviet Russia attacked Poland from the east. And they divided the country and also other countries in Eastern Europe. So how does Ryazanovsky describe that? And I quote, "This was the rectification of the Western frontier." Rectification of the Western frontier. It's almost like Hitler could have not put it better. This is from the point of view of Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. This was, of course, nothing but rectification of the Western frontier, whereas Germany could say it was a rectification of the Eastern frontier. But you see this book, which is probably the best read and most popular history of Russia that is read by not just American students, but people that want to get acquainted with Russia. This book is still being sold in large numbers. You look at Amazon and you see the popularity of this book, and you have therefore hundreds of thousands of people educated by this kind of presentation. Now, that is obviously not correct, and this is what colonization has done. It has falsified history, and it is something that I think we need to redo slowly, because you cannot redo it in a quick way. You have to produce scholars, you have to produce intellects that would be able to cope with falsifications and be able to present history of Central Europe in a correct way. Second person that I wanted to mention is Stephen Cohen, who was a professor of political science at Princeton for many years, just as Jasanowski at Harvard, Cohen at Princeton. And he was, I'm not exaggerating, he was sympathetically inclined towards the Soviet Union. And in 1985, he wrote a book entitled Rethinking the Soviet Experience. And I remember I went to buy that book, and was elated, that I'll finally find a book that will criticize the Soviet Union. You know what this book says? Basically, the book says that the Soviet Union is a very sturdy structure. It's not going to be destroyed in any easy way, and we're going to live with it forever. In 5 years, this Soviet Union disappeared. It fell apart. So did Stephen Cohen apologize before the profession? Did he write an article saying, "I'm sorry, I was wrong"? No, not at all. He just continued teaching at Princeton, then he taught at New York University. So again, you have hundreds, maybe thousands of students that they were sort of influenced by his vision of the Soviet Union, sympathetic, without vision that didn't include the Gulag, the vision that didn't include the repression of so many nationalities and so many individuals. And the final name that I would like to mention is someone who is still alive, and that is Dmitry Trenin. Dmitry Trenin, like the other two, taught at American universities, Columbia mostly. He spent many years in the United States. He was the head of the Carnegie Center in Moscow, of course, paid by the United States. And he too wrote a book that was really appeared completely, almost totally missed the goal, so to speak. The book was titled, "Should We Fear Russia?" And it was published in 2019. And of course, the book said, no, of course not. Russia is a friendly country. 3 years later, Russia invaded Ukraine. And then Dmitry Trenin absconded from the United States. He's now in Moscow. I haven't followed up his career, whether he's alive or dead, or whether he's teaching at Moscow University or someplace else. But again, now these are the people that taught our students. These are the people that created America's image of Russia. And it was completely wrong. And we have to do something about it if we want to decolonize our minds, and if we want to decolonize the minds of our former students or present-day students. So these are sort of examples of colonialism as it is reflected in expository writing. For, as I said, colonialism allows the colonizing power to write the history, not just of itself, but also of the territories it has conquered. But there's another advantage of colonialism. It's also cultural, and that is literature, written from the point of view of the colonizer. And in literature, things are much more subtle than in, say, writing of history, as I presented to you. In literature, the influence of colonial, or the colonial advantage, is presented in a much more toned down way. And sometimes it's almost impossible not to be biased in favor of the colonialists, because, well, this is the nature of literature. And I have in mind here, in particular, War and Peace. War and Peace is a great novel. So please don't tell me that I'm speaking against one of the greatest novels ever written, because I think it's one of the greatest novels ever written. And I'm happy that, Tolstoy wrote the novel. However, whether he wanted it or not, and whether he did it consciously or not, there's an enormous amount of elements in War and Peace that not only distort history, but sort of teach the reader a completely wrong, give the reader a completely wrong vision of what was going on in Russia and what was going on in territories, in the colonies of Russia. So the first thing that I'm going to tell you, it will shock you, because you know that in 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia, right? No, wrong. Napoleon did not invade Russia. Napoleon invaded Russia's colonies. And people in the colonies were deliriously happy to be invaded by Napoleon. And they greeted him as a freedom, somebody who was bringing freedom to them. In fact, the nobility in Lithuania put their monies together and organized a big party for Napoleon in Vilnius, which is now the capital of Lithuania. And in War and Peace, by the way, the narrator tells us that in Vilnius, the happy nobility organized a party for Alexander I. Total nonsense, because maybe there was a party for Alexander I, but it was done by the Russians, occupiers. In other words, it was not something done spontaneously by the population of Lithuania. The population of Lithuania, as I said, was Polish-speaking at the time, the nobility at least, and they organized this big party for Napoleon. They wanted him to come. They greeted him as a liberator. In fact, the Poland and Lithuania produced a volunteer army of 80,000 people to fight on Napoleon's side. Napoleon had 600,000 people in his army, and you added 80,000, that's a considerable addition, isn't it? And what killed Napoleon eventually, as we know, is the Russian winter, but that's still another thread about Kutuzov. I may be able to talk about that a little bit later on. So you see, as you read War and Peace, and you hear the narrator, or you read the narrator describing the invasion of the Russian Empire, you are led to believe that there are no nations between Germany and Russia, Prussia at that time, Prussia and Russia. You just go through territory that is Russian, and then to the left, or rather on the map, you see Germany. And that's not true. There are nations there that had histories that were longer than Russian history, and literature and culture, at least on par with Russian. But it's completely, it's not there. And you are, say, a reader of War and Peace. You admire Tolstoy, as you well should, because, as I said, it's a great novel. And you sort of go back to normal life, and you subconsciously know that there are no nations there between Germany and Russia, and you vote for Yalta then. To see what I mean? I mean, after World War II, basically the entire Eastern Europe and parts of Central Europe were given to the Soviets, and people who were there, Churchill, Roosevelt, so forth, might not themselves have read War and Peace, but they were educated by people who read War and Peace, and they felt, that those nations, but they're not really nations, they're being Russified so quickly enough, and might as well be Russian. Well, as we know, those nations are very stubborn, and they do not want to disappear. And Ukraine right now is a good example that surprised us all. So you see how Tolstoy, who was really, in a sense, an innocent person in it, presented the kind of vision of Russian Empire that the Russians were trying to introduce through other means, political means. And as I said, hundreds of thousands of people read War and Peace, if not millions. And something of that presentation was left there and still is being imbibed by readers of War and Peace. And then let me say a few words about the two portraits of leaders that appear in War and Peace. One is Alexander I, and the second is Napoleon. Alexander I is seen by Nicholas Rostov, who is a very sympathetic character. I think we all like him, during a battle. And Nicholas sees the Tsar seated on horseback, and he looks great. He looks like a knight in a white armor on a white horse, and Rostov feels that he could do anything. He would do anything for the Tsar. Anything the Tsar wanted him to do, he would rush into the fire. He would jump into battle. He would do anything, and we are left with this very positive image of Alexander I. Fair enough. Now let's look at Napoleon, how he's described by the narrator here. Now, the leader of the French is described as a short, fat, and stupid. Now, we know that he was short and he was overweight, but he was not stupid. He was one of the geniuses of military planning. In fact, his Battle of Austerlitz is presented in military textbooks as one of the great battles of humanity. And his tactics and strategy during Battle of Austerlitz are being studied by people who are interested in military affairs. So we, again, are led to believe that Napoleon was a bad guy. He invaded Russia, where he just brought freedom to those colonized peoples in Central and Eastern Europe, and that we should sympathize with the Russians in this battle with Napoleon. Of course, if you read the book in English, the English-speaking people are not particularly fond of Napoleon, so they may like that kind of presentation. But it's a question of objectivity. You know, Napoleon was a great leader. His soldiers admired him; they worshipped him. I don't know about Alexander I. We are told that Nicholas worshipped him, but I don't know whether there's any particular literary historical documentation saying that he was as worshipped as much as, say, as Napoleon was. But we'll leave that aside. You see, there are subtle falsifications here in the way the narrator in War and Peace describes events, and this is inevitable, and it is the kind of point of view that you take if you are if you are inside the colonizing power. And one more thing about this leading us to dislike the French and saying, you know, the French are simply invaders and Russia was just fighting a defensive war. As you start War and Peace, you know that the novel starts with the description of a party that was given by the lady in waiting in St. Petersburg, Anna Scherer, and you meet many major characters in War and Peace during that party. You meet Pierre Bezukhov, for instance, this gentle giant that impossible not to like him. Then you meet the wife of Andrei Bolkonsky, the prince who gets killed in the war with Napoleon, and she dies too in childbirth. You meet indirectly Nicholas Rostov and a number of other people who talk. They are very nice, they're very reasonable, they're civilized people, and you sort of develop a sympathy for them. It's impossible not to sympathize with those people in Anna Scherer's salon because they are so reasonable. So, right from the very beginning, you are preconditioned to dislike anybody who makes this bucolic scene disappear. You want those people to prevail, not Napoleon, not this guy who is short, fat, and stupid, obviously. So, there's a certain line of thinking that is encouraged by the narrator in War and Peace or any other novel that makes us realize, after we reflect on the novel, that the novel is not only great, beautifully presented. The novel does not only present human life in a remarkably successful way, but also makes us very gently sympathize with one party and makes us opposed to the other party. So that's, again, something that being a colonialist allows you to do, because who's going to reach for a novel written by, don't want to offend anybody, but some small nationality, somewhere there in between Russia and or between Ukraine and Romania. Somebody will, write a novel in Moldovan, and will you reach for that novel, or would you rather reach for the novel written by a Russian writer who, in addition to everything else, is considered a great writer? Obviously, you'll reach for the great writer rather than some obscure, little-known writer from Moldova. So again, advantages of colonialism are numerous, and in culture, you have the opportunity to present the point of view, to present the storyline that the colonialist wants to perpetuate. And you forget about the storylines that were completely suppressed by the colonialists. And I could now go into the Caucasus and describe in great detail Pushkin's and Lermontov's ways of dealing with the natives of the Caucasus, but you know what I mean. I mean, basically, the description of those conquered people is always negative, much more crudely so than, say, in Tolstoy. And anybody who read, say, Pushkin's poems about the Caucasus knows that, of course, Russians should rule that territory because, well, those people are simply not able to rule themselves. So now, if we put it all together and we think about so-called Slavic studies that have existed at American universities and also European universities, certainly in Great Britain, we realize that basically those Slavic studies teach nothing but Russian studies, and that the voices of those who have been conquered are simply not heard there. And if you look at the numbers for each person in non-Russian Slavic studies, you'll probably find 10 specialists in Russian at any major university in the United States. Maybe not that many. Now there's a great reduction of Russian studies as well. But until say 2 decades ago, it was the Russian studies basically that people looked at and studied rather than Slavic studies. So if you study things and you look at things from the point of view of the Russians, you read Jasanovsky's history, you read the history of the Soviet Union by Stephen Cohen, or if you, not until recently, read the articles and books by Dmitry Trenin, you would say, well, gee, this is a very nice country and we should try to ingratiate ourselves to it rather than feeling hostile towards it. Well, it's such a possibility exists, of course, but it would be done at the expense of many nations that are located between Germany and Russia. And right now, as we know, one of those nations is simply saying, no, we are not going to allow Russians to impose their vision of history. We're not allowing Russians to impose their rule over us. We want to be Ukrainians. So it's a big dilemma. And my suggestion, as I said, is that we should slowly but move away from Russian studies and introduce more non-Russian Slavic studies. And this way we can perhaps eventually reach some kind of balance between the narration that is being proffered by the Russians and the narration by those nations that they have been so far suppressed. So decolonization and the studies of decolonization concerning Russia are really a worthy goal to pursue. And I thank you for listening to me for such a long time. I'd be happy to take questions if you have any.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Thompson. That was nothing short of enlightening, and not necessarily in Voltaire's sense being paid by Catherine. So